Arthur, an overpromoted gangster. Merlin, an eldritch parasite. Excalibur, a shady deal with a watery arms dealer. Britain, a clogged sewer that Rome abandoned just as soon as it could. Hello and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Himbar, and today I will be doing a spoiler-free review of Lavie Tidhar's By Force Alone. By Force Alone is a 2020 novel by Lavie Tidhar and is book 1 in the Antimatter of Britain quartet, book 2 being Hood, which is about Robin Hood of sorts. I've not read that one yet, of course, as I, somewhat recently finished this one. I was in a big Arthurian mood at the beginning of this year. This one actually has some good epigrams you should read. I was going to read them actually for this review, but my copy is in a room with a sleeping baby. I do not feel like disturbing that beast. So this actually starts with the fall of Vortigern, which is pretty typical. Repeats the pride of ruling and taking the kingship by force alone. Uther makes quick work of him, and this is the first half of the 6th century where we would see a historical Arthur if such a person did exist. There is some interesting language here, right? Instead of puffed up and elevated like a romance, it's rather vulgar, like you may read in Chaucer or Shakespeare even. The first page uses this word quim, not a word like you ever read, but the second page has the F word. The second chapter gives us Greek wine, contemplations on atoms, and flying to the moon. We also get Pellinore and Merlin. Chapter 3 has an erection and a good joke. In reality, this is much of the content found in other Arthuriana, but with a different flavor. It kind of seems like a modern vulgarity, right? And it is almost entirely displayed as a joke rather than something that is neat. But a lot of it, the story is actually still pretty much intact and the same. But it should be obvious at the start, or even at this point in the review, whether this book would work for you or not. It does take from Geoffrey of Monmouth and Thomas Malory, but you could actually not have read any Arthuriana to read this irreverent deconstruction. And it's very wholesome in a sense. It's irreverent. I mean, it's not for kids, but it's kind of a humorous take, like Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, or Monty Python's and Holy Grail. Arthur is central to the matter of Britain in politics and national identity. He is a favorite of the Romantics for this reason. And it takes the historiography elements and goes in the fantasy direction, which is entertaining. I love something like Sword and Sunset by Rosemary Sutcliffe, and even the medieval versions, the romances themselves. But this is also a purposeful attack on the historical take. Now, we don't really see Arthur generally in this case anymore. A lot of those early histories before the romances got more popular, a bit like Wace or Lachaman or even Geoffrey of Monmouth, those are chronicles and they're histories, right? But what we call them nowadays is more of literature, right? So it's kind of a blending of history and literature, at least from our point of view today. But in the story, the men are jerks, right? Kind of like they are in Lamort D'Arthur, actually, if you read Lamort D'Arthur. That's not the case in all of the romances. I would say, for example, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you definitely have these nice ideals and a very good lesson to be learned. But Lamort D'Arthur is a little bit rougher around the edges. So Tidhar calls them gangsters and uses contemporary low-life things to associate them with. This revolves around power and involves battle and sex, which are portrayed as normal human behavior, right? And selfishness and a lack of self-awareness are included too in that. It attacks our ideas of the so-called Dark Ages and as well as Christianity as well during that time. The women in this version have agency. They're active parts of the story, whether they're fairy queens, poisoners, highwaymen, or highwaywomen, I guess, etc. Igraine may be the sad exception, or is she? Anyways, the Saxons and the Jutes seem to be analogous to current immigrants in the UK. This is, of course, calls into question so-called British identity and colonialism rather than English identity. This is related to the so-called chivalry of these knights. And again, it plays along with this idea of Arthur in the first place. I mean, a lot of the Arthurian stuff definitely promotes a certain political view. I would argue it doesn't all promote the same. I would say that Lachaman's Brute, for example, is definitely more of the Anglo-Saxon feeling suppressed by Norman invasions, which was still recent at that time, and kind of comparing these recently conquered Anglo-Saxons with this noble past to today's Welsh, right, and their British past. So it's pretty interesting. And Tidhar isn't exactly saying, right, that they all have the same view, because Arthuriana doesn't have the same view. It's never had this one conclusive view. I do think Arthuriana is a good showcase, though, of kind of just the liminality of reality, right? That there's always a transition point. There's always going to be a narrative, but that narrative is actually going to change, I feel like, right? I mean, because Lachaman, we don't really distinguish between Normans and English these days. They're all just English, pretty much. So, and depending on your point of view, they might all be bastards too. But anyways, so I think Tidhar is being super clever here, right? Which, you can tell in his display of emotions, his humor. It's kind of, you can see it in his sci-fi and also in his weird stuff, which is kind of weird. We get lots of quotes from odd things, such as Oppenheimer and various philosophers or movies from old school karate films, for example, or moves. And it's a lesson to make fantasy more fantastic and weird to many writers, too. It's got a literary point, but it is very, very fun. And I like the lessons of the chivalry of some old Arthuriana, right? Like, again, Sir Gawain the Green Knight has some great lessons. This is likely, again, more against certain exploits of Lord Arthur than anything. London here is a cesspool and essentially a post-apocalyptic setting, which is pretty accurate, actually, as far as post-Roman Britain goes. And Arthur deals with other gangs, including selling goblin fruit, essentially. And this is less like the fairy fruit of Blood in the Mist, but is simply ergot. Apparently, those involved in the mysteries of Mithras enjoy it. And we get references to Brutus of Troy and homoeroticism and Greek porn, which, is just Greeks for you. And while early medieval Britain actually does have wannabe kings as kings, it's portrayed as dog-eat-dog struggle here. I wouldn't be surprised if Tidhar is aware that knight originally just meant boy, as that's what the knights are in large part. And that address of knight is really just the same address as boy today is. But we get the hallmarks: Sir Kay, Elion, Nimue, Morgause, the Green Knights, and like, even Grendel and his mother. Kay is a point of view. The questing beast is also here, the Sword and Stone, Morgan Le Fay, Eschenbach's version of the Grail as well. Honestly, I'm really impressed with how long this book is, how much Tidhar is able to fit in. And it's funny, at times very funny. The die casting, the sheep incident, the Bogarts in the bar. It feels a little like Shrek almost. And Tidhar is so self-aware of the world and hypocrisy and baseless of humanity. It's not Deux mon doigt, but Saut Fosse, which... man, the way he uses by force alone in this book had me saying it way too many times after reading it. While the cursing loses some of its charm, I think, with just so much dialogue, and that happens swiftly, it's sometimes hard to follow. These are kind of my only complaints. My other big complaint is that the first half is more compelling than the second half, and I think that's because he is trying to do all of it, pretty much, that it just doesn't stay interesting the whole time, or at least that interesting. But it's still very fun. And a lot of my complaints though is stuff done on purpose, right? Like that dialogue and the cursing. That's on purpose. It just wasn't exactly to my liking, but it is not bad the whole time, like I said. And of course, we also have the characters acting like dude bros and nincompoops, and right. I mean, again, that's on purpose. Merlin was maybe my favorite character though, but also it's irreverent but still faithful in a sense. I probably should feel uncomfortable at times. I feel like reading this, and Arthur does get a bit of the backseat later in the book, which kind of goes along with what I already said. And his character is mostly sidelined then, but this is I don't know. I mean, like, this is kind of what makes sense, right? Tidhar is telling so many of the stories that involve Arthur. It's largely fine, but just isn't as entertaining, I guess. But overall, really enjoyable. Very interesting. I'm glad I read it. I hear Hood is different, so shall see what I think when I get there. Tidhar is very much just someone worth reading. And it's funny, after I have all this to say, this is probably my least favorite Tidhar book I've read. But they've all been pretty darn amazing, so I guess that has to happen. Even good books can be least favorite sometimes. Anyways, Liam from Liam's Ice. I'll catch you next time.